If digital identity is going to be the future, it has to work for everyone.
I would love to see us help them skip physical identity documents altogether. And let's just go straight to digital identity.
Wouldn't that be the perfect world, though?
I feel like consumers have become so callous to data breaches that they almost don't even register anymore.
No, I'm really scared.
I like how positive we've been on this podcast episode today. Hello, dear audience, and welcome back to Series 3 of What the Fraud, a podcast by Sumsub, where digital fraudsters meet their match. I'm Thomas Taraniuk, Head of Partnerships here at Sumsub, the global verification platform helping to verify users, businesses, and transactions as well. Governments worldwide are racing to roll out digital identity systems, promising greater convenience, security, and efficiency, of course. From Estonia's e-residency program to Singapore's SingPass, these initiatives are gaining momentum. The UK is also launching its own digital wallet to store official documents this year in 2025. But with new technology comes new risks. Hackers recently exposed vulnerabilities in Germany's digital ID system, affecting over 10 million users. And in India, login credentials were leaked on the dark web for just $8 as per the Aadhaar database. And in this episode today, we will sit down with Daniel Flowe, Head of Digital Identity at the London Stock Exchange Group, and Eddie Moxon-Garcia, Product Marketing Lead at Sumsub, to hear what's being developed in the new digital ID sector and find out whether there really can be a reusable identity solution that balances privacy, security, and accessibility as well. Daniel, Eddie, thank you so much for coming on the show with us today. I would love to get straight into it if you don't mind. So Daniel, if I turn to you first, I'd like to address digital IDs. It is going absolutely global right now, and you're right at the center of it at the London Stock Exchange Group. So how did you get into the world of digital ID in the first place, and how has the landscape evolved since you started?
So I got into digital ID, I think the way most everybody gets into most anything, through personal connections and some friends. So I started interacting with a startup called Global Data Consortium back in the mid-2010s. Worked with them on and off as an advisor through that period, and then came on as a full-time employee sometime around 2020. And the London Stock Exchange Group bought us in 2022. It has been an interesting ride through the space. I got involved because it's just full of interesting problems. We've got 8.5 billion people globally. How do we enable them all to participate in the digital economy, to transact, to prove who they are? How do we keep people safe online? How do we protect people from fraud? And it seems like there's just never an end to the opportunities to learn, grow, and hopefully stay ahead of the fraudsters. I think the big change for us is, 10 years ago, there was a lot of human intervention in identity verification. There was a huge focus on documents. And many times you would see a lot of that work really being performed behind the scenes by human beings with eyes on glass. And the technology for fraud detection, the technology for liveness has come so far, and the adoption of digital IDs has come so far. It's like being in a whole new space than the one I started in.
Absolutely, Daniel. I mean, that's a big mission, I think, one that we're all a part of, the democratization of access to, of course, digital services globally for those underserved. But that means sort of releasing those moats, those barriers to entry for those individuals. And of course, having people on the back end actually go through and do everything manually, and over usage of ID documents, etc., can also sort of kill progress. So, Eddie, great to have you on the podcast finally. I would like to kick off with a forward question. What, in your opinion, are the benefits of digital ID compared to traditional methodologies?
First, I have to agree with Daniel that it's a fascinating space, but it's just riddled with problems every new day. We come up against new challenges. So it does keep us interested, I would say. I would say the biggest difference and benefit is that digital reusable identity aims to remove repetitive onboarding steps. And this is a major bottleneck for businesses and users. So it's not just something that only companies need to worry about. Right now, if you want to sign up for a new service, open a new bank account, access a crypto exchange, maybe just join an online marketplace, you have to go through a pretty much identical process from scratch every single time. And that is very tedious for you, but it also leads to drop-offs and rejections and so on. So the premise of reusable identity is that you can verify once and then reuse that verification across multiple platforms. So this does mean faster onboarding and lower drop-off rates, which makes everybody happy. But I do think that there is an argument to be made about financial inclusivity. Our own research, which came in the form of an initiative called Green Flag, there's a fantastic white paper out, I encourage everyone to read it, shows that there are 627 million people across the world that are digitally excluded. And I can go into the reasons a bit later on, but the point is that 627 million people represent 1.75 trillion US dollars of missed opportunity for businesses. So making identity digital and reusable, but also universally recognized, is something that companies should care about, because it's not about just reducing friction for users. It's about expanding their market and revenue potential. And I would say that's a pretty big benefit.
Definitely, Eddie. And we're talking about solving a massive problem here. And it's like one step at a time, as I'd always think. This year, the UK government is planning to introduce a new digital wallet storing official documents, such as driving licenses, which will be completely digital. So countries like Germany and Estonia have already implemented similar systems with mixed results. Daniel, why is there such a demand for digital IDs right now?
I think there's always been demand, especially as, if you look at the last 25 years, as we've moved from having our digital selves and our digital participation a complementary element of our lives, it's really become how we live our lives. I like to use this as an example. I work from a home office. I bank with a financial institution that doesn't have a physical branch anywhere near me. I live in the United States and I work for a company based in London. So my digital self, my transacting online, the accounts that I sign up for and the things that I do, they're not a complementary element of my life. They are my life. And if you go back to all the protocols that the internet has, there's no identity protocol. There never has been. And what we have done throughout especially the last 25 to 30 years, is we've made it work with physical photographic IDs and user-controlled devices. And that fundamentally is a useful and purposeful workaround. The photo ID, I always like to point out, was invented by the British in 1915 during the Great War because they were concerned about German spies entering the UK. If you go back, let's say 10 years, if you wanted to verify yourself online, you were using 100-year-old technology at core to establish who you are and gain entry into a system or a financial institution that you wanted to. So I would argue that for as long as people have been transacting online, there's been the need for a digital identity or a way to assert and proof your identity that is truly digital. I think what we're seeing in the last 5 years particularly is our governments, our regulators are catching up to that demand and are starting to recognize the digital world for what it is and the need of their constituents and consumers for what they are. So not to be overly picky, but I would argue the demand's always been there. I think we're just finally seeing some of our older institutions catch up to it and offer what people have always wanted online.
Absolutely. So I do agree there as well. Eddie, what do you think on the matter, may I ask?
I agree also. I think the demand has always been there, but the high demand that we're seeing today is, I would say, being driven by this perfect storm of regulatory pressure, security concerns, and consumer expectations. And I think those expectations come from the reality of people's lives. Already, governments worldwide are recognizing that paper-based identification just doesn't cut it for a digital-first economy. And if we take the UK's digital wallet initiative, for example, and Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, please keep me honest, it's part of a wider push towards self-sovereign identity, where people can control and reuse their digital credentials without needing to repeatedly submit sensitive documents. At the same time, I think that businesses are under pressure to improve onboarding while staying compliant, and regulators are tightening KYC and AML rules, but users still expect a seamless digital experience. So I think that digital identity is the only way to meet both of these demands simultaneously. No solution should only focus on efficiency. It has to be about security and usability as well. There's a great example about Germany when they rolled out their digital ID system. It exposed a bunch of security gaps, and I think it was around 10 million users that were affected ultimately. So it does highlight why we need this balance between security and usability. So yes, the demand is high, but I would say that the real question is, can we have these solutions and systems designed in a way that is truly secure, inclusive, and scalable?
Absolutely. It needs to be robust at the end of the day. The idea is to stop fraudsters, right? And from our perspective as well, we do know, Eddie, of course, that the biggest type of identity fraud that we've seen, making up 50% of cases, is indeed ID cards as the most exploited type of document, of course. And they're being used in around 70% of identity document fraud. So from the other angle, Daniel, what sort of benefits can digital ID offer people when it comes to protecting themselves online compared to, let's say, the most, abused non-digital IDs that have been the target from fraudsters as well?
Yeah, and I think you touch on what is a really important element in this discussion, which is that we shouldn't fall in the trap of expecting a new technology to be perfect. We should expect it to be better. And I see a lot of arguments against digital ID pointing out places where there have been breaches and there have been failures, and I don't think there's any denying that there have been and there will be privacy and security issues with digital IDs. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, are we more private and more secure under some of the digital ID schemes than we are under today's scheme, where if I lose my wallet, I've lost my identity card, and for about $15, I can get a pretty convincing digital ID that has my face and my signature on it and a completely fictitious name and address.
15 sounds like quite a lot as well, Daniel. I've seen them go for $4 or $5.
Yeah, who are you dealing with?
I want one of the good ones.
You're being scammed there.
I think that's the thing that we have to get to. And you guys have some great research on how much fraud is undertaken with counterfeit identity documents and synthetic IDs. That needs to be our initial point of comparison when we talk about safety, security, privacy of digital IDs, not a sort of fictitious, perfect world where everything is secure, seamless, frictionless, and confidential.
Wouldn't that be the perfect world, though? I mean, that's what we're sort of always going for. So from the fraud prevention perspective, do you think a digital-first approach will reduce risks or introduce new ones? And what would those risks be if that was the case?
I mean, I think yes is the answer to that question. It will both reduce risks and introduce them. So we'll have new and interesting risks. I do think that we should really limit our scope to those that are doing it well, and that require active user input on a known user-controlled device. That cuts out a lot of that. I have a colleague that is based in Sweden, and one of the examples he uses is that he can easily pull up his tax ID, his name and his address, and his date of birth. And it's public information in Sweden. It's quite easy to find. But the way they've structured Bank ID and the way they've structured a lot of the security around it, it doesn't matter. No one can impersonate him and interact with any of his accounts, because ultimately they have to be able to utilize his bank ID via a device that he controls. So in a lot of ways, I think that well-executed digital ID schemes take the teeth out of those data leaks, because they make that data less useful, not more.
Definitely the case. Eddie, are you on the same page as well?
Definitely. I mean, your question was around, are there new risks in addition to the old ones? And 100%, I think it's also not that black and white, right? I do believe that a digital first approach is essential for fighting fraud, especially at scale, but it has to be intelligent and adaptive. Like automation, AI, and behavioral analysis have already massively improved fraud detection. The biggest advantage is that it removes reliance on human judgment and outdated manual processes. With analog systems, the risk was, I think, more apparent because we had to rely on how well trained the person was to spot a fake document, for example, or how accurate the physical scanning equipment was. And these methods were prone to human error and inefficiencies. The risk now with the new technology, I think, comes from overcompensating somehow. If you have a really strict fraud prevention system, it can exclude legitimate users.
Yes.
A really good example of this is biometric verification. It's a great fraud fighting tool, but it's not foolproof. Our research again shows, I think it was around 96 million people who face verification challenges because they've had changes in their physical appearance, because they've aged, or they had a medical condition, they've had hair loss, even gender transitions, and so on. So a rigid system may misclassify people as fraud risks and lock them out unfairly. And that's something that should be thought of when you're trying to implement these solutions. I think another big one is country-based restrictions. So many companies automatically block users from high-risk regions. And there is a large subset of the population who are affected by a blanket ban that doesn't account for individual legitimacy. So in order to sort of mitigate this, you should be using AI-powered risk scoring that assesses behavior dynamically rather than denying access outright. So there isn't a silver bullet to say there's no risk, everyone here is legitimate, they have all the good intentions. There should be a combination of all these different tools that we have at our disposal today. And as Daniel said, no solution is perfect. We have to keep iterating and seeing what works. And the nature of the solution, in my opinion, should be very much dynamic and able to adapt and have a different approach for different users.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, iteration is essential. Innovation is painful. So there is going to be friction at the start as well. But we've talked about why governments now, of course, are very excited about this. I'm excited about it. Financial institutions are as well, specifically in Europe, of course. And the new forms of the digital ID are going to, well, of course, have changes. But what I'd love to touch on from both of your perspectives, and Eddie, you did this quite nicely as well, is what about the public? I mean, the FIs are happy, the governments are happy, and we're moving forward. But is the public embracing this shift, let's say? Is there skepticism that we're seeing about security and privacy? Daniel, would you want to take this first?
Sure. And so many ID schemes, there's so many countries that it's really hard to give a blanket answer. I think you're seeing a few things that are really driving that user adoption and user trust. So there are a few interesting reports out there. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Tata Foundation are heavily involved in this. And PwC has some interesting reports out. But it seems like you start to see a tipping point of user adoption when a couple of things are present. So one is that sort of table stakes level safety and security. It really comes down to, does the average citizen consumer trust the government with their data and believe that it is going to be held and maintained safely? The second thing that you see is number of services available that access the digital ID. And we tend to see tipping points around 100 services. So if you look at a country like Estonia, right, there's hundreds and hundreds of services that will accept the EID. It's very commonly used. Same thing in the Nordics, the same thing in Singapore and India. Where you tend to run into trouble is when you see in some countries where there's a fairly small number of services that are available to a consumer on that digital ID, and you find that they'll maybe sign up once and then not use it again. So we see that.
Right.
I like to use Hong Kong, their digital ID as an example there, where there's really only a few things you can do with it. Everybody signed up for it and then stopped using it. And then I think the third thing, and what really seems to move consumer adoption forward, is frankly forced usage from government services. Your government services or your bank require you to use that digital ID to access services. We see massive spikes in adoption. So one of the examples there is a service like It's Me in Belgium, where for a lot of residents in Belgium to access government services, they're required to use that. So you see massive adoption essentially because it's been forced. What about you, Eddie? What do you see?
It's such an interesting point about forced adoption, because I do think there's definitely a divide in public perception. On one hand, people want faster, easier access to services, banking, government benefits, whatever it may be. But trust is a big challenge. Many people worry about data privacy, surveillance, and security breaches. And as we saw with the example from Germany, they have good reason to do so. So I think the key here would be transparency and user control. Yes, there is enthusiasm, but I think the real test is how well these systems address the security concerns and ensure inclusion so that we're not leaving the legitimate users out. But ultimately, if people don't feel that they can benefit from a digital identity scheme, or if a certain group is being locked out, I don't think it'll gain the mass adoption that governments and businesses are hoping for.
Well, and I think I like to look at Aadhaar in India as a great example of an EID that rolled out to a massive, billion plus person population. When Aadhaar was rolled out, I think the World Economic Forum said 25% of Indians were living in extreme poverty. So you've got a massive population, you got a geographically dispersed population, and you've got a high degree of impoverished people in that population, and yet they have been incredibly successful at achieving adoption, widespread usage. There have been some data security issues, but I think on the whole, when you look at the Indian economy, when you look at the declining poverty rates, the increased participation in the digital economy from the Indian citizens, I think you see that it can be done. And it can be done well.
Absolutely. And Eddie, correct me if I'm wrong there. I think Daniel touched on a very good point, but it's 97% of the adult population between 16 and 65, right, in India have access to that Aadhaar scheme, and which is amazing. And of course, the country has been known for very, very large, very good adopted censuses of the population as well. And that's super important to understand the population and also provide them with access to those digital services which they might not already have. But you also touched on the security sort of side. I mean, the security debate around digital IDs is massive. We touched upon it briefly now, but whilst these government schemes, of course, offer or promise, let's say, convenience, storing sensitive IDs within a single digital wallet, I mean, it creates a clear sort of target for hackers. Even if there are limitations around how they can actually gain access to those, there's obviously the attraction for them. So experts across the world worry that linking passports, driver's license, and all of these digital services with their credentials into one system creates a centralized point of failure. So I would ask both of you, actually, how can digital ID systems be secured without introducing one single attack vector? I mean, what measures, other than what we've talked about today, have been put in place?
First of all, it's a very valid concern and point to raise. I think anyone would be terrified if they knew their whole life was contained in one single place, right? So it is about reducing reliance on a single point of failure. And there's a lot of conversation around different topics. I think the main one would be decentralization and a push for self-sovereign identity. So giving users the control of their data and so on. I think a more practical measure, though, is this adaptive risk-based authentication. So as I said before, instead of treating everyone the same and evaluating in the same way, there's different prevention systems that will analyze behavior, device intelligence, location patterns, and so on, just looking for anomalies. So if a login attempt looks unusual, additional verification is triggered. And so I think this is a very practical way to ensure security. Another one is decoupled verification. Many systems allow for separate authentication away from storage. So when you do biometric verification, that can be done locally on your device, on your mobile phone, without storing that raw biometric data in a central database somewhere else. So this alone reduces hacking risks and increases user control. It also increases that sense of security and so on. So those two are far more practical, in my opinion, than decentralization, because inherently it does feel like you're putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely spot on response. I think the only counter I'll offer is I feel like consumers have become so callous to data breaches that they almost don't even register anymore. Like, you know, how many times has T-Mobile's database been breached? I've frankly lost count, and not to pick on them specifically, but you know, as you look at your digital footprint as a consumer, one of the things that I always try to explain to people is every service you work with is maintaining some version of your digital identity behind the scenes that you have no control over. So Amazon has one set of information on me that they maintain in a place I don't know, with security I can't control, and have absolutely no say over what they do with the data, and kind of so on and so forth across all the services that I use. So I in no way mean to diminish the risks, and I think we have to put things in place to minimize them, and we can do a lot better than we are today. But I do think we have to come back to, it's not like it's secure right now, and it's not like everyone that's listening to this podcast hasn't been the victim of a data leak or a data breach, probably in the last few months.
Absolutely not. So we talked about this a lot on our podcast, right? It's a little bit of a broken record in my own mind, but AI, it's been used by fraudsters on a day-to-day basis, not only for, of course, deepfakes, but as Daniel has mentioned earlier, for document creation and the fraudulent documents, which can actually bypass systems and, of course, return a very good, let's say, ROI for the actual fraudster themselves. So as for businesses, what can they do to adjust their systems to digital IDs whilst protecting themselves from possible attacks using AI, deepfakes or otherwise, Eddie?
I think my advice is very simple. The execution might be a little bit more complex, but let's try. I would encourage businesses to take a very proactive approach when it comes to fighting AI fraud, because the fraudsters are evolving just as fast as the technology. AI-driven attacks, especially deepfakes and synthetic identities, have become so sophisticated. And as Daniel mentioned earlier, most fraud attempts a while ago were just based on stolen documents. Now we have AI-generated faces, voice cloning, entire fake personas slipping through the cracks of weak verification systems. So in terms of what can be done practically, I would say, number one, and this is something we love to say at Sumsub, is fight AI with AI. Enlist the power of machine learning for fraud detection. Deepfake detection models can analyze subtle facial distortions, unnatural blinking patterns, inconsistencies in skin texture, things that the human eye just might miss, right? And then behavioral AI can become a tool for evaluating user interactions, like keystrokes. Device data also might help determine whether an identity is real or fake. The second point would be a multi-layered approach to identity proofing, not relying on a single authentication factor. So layer it, biometric liveness detection on top of device intelligence, on top of behavioral analytics. Do as much of it as you can in a mix and match way, depending on the use case, depending on the user, and so on. And then the last one would be adaptive risk-based authentication, as I mentioned before. Just trying to look for these patterns and only surface additional checks when it's absolutely necessary. And I think if a company does all of this, they're not just improving security, it's reducing unnecessary friction for those legitimate users.
Absolutely. And of course, on the business side as well, I mean, there's a lot of security risks, challenges as well in making digital IDs truly fraud resistant, of course. I mean, Daniel, from your perspective as well, are there key security features being prioritized right now for businesses, or otherwise would you recommend that businesses focus on similar elements as Eddie has pointed out?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Eddie said is excellent.
Yeah.
It was a really good answer. I would just add in, I think that the more that you as a business can widen the aperture when you're looking at an individual, the harder and harder it is for someone to have really any kind of attack, much less a presented content AI attack. So, and I may be overpaying. Apparently, I'm overpaying for my fake IDs. We'll talk about it after the podcast. But you know, I can make up an identity and an address and a date of birth, and I can have an identity document for a fairly small amount of money. Now, if I were to try to create a credit record for that identity, that's a whole lot harder and takes a whole lot more time. So the more that organizations are able to broaden out and not only just look at the presented content, but also look to verify it with independent authoritative sources, that's one of the big ways that we see organizations handle that challenge of generated content. And I think that the second way that we see that is really relying heavily on things that involve active user participation and consent. So, you know, I love SingPass. I love the way that they require active engagement from the user on a known device. And it's much easier for you to create a video of me that might get past somebody else's biometric or liveness scans. It's entirely another for someone to control a known device that's in my possession and give consent on it.
Definitely. It's super important as well, Daniel, just to have a multi-layered approach to everything you do around making sure the person is who they say they are. And by all means, that can stop, of course, the nefarious actors who are trying to bypass systems. But with the development and also sort of exponential growth of social engineering as well, people often handing over the reins to these accounts as well, which is something that we need to bear in mind, right? I mean, at Sumsub, developing the Sumsub ID involved extensive planning and also refinement to ensure the robust security of the network as well. And there's a few other things that we could touch upon here. But Eddie, I'd like to sort of pose a question to you as well. Would you be able to sort of break down exactly how that works from our side?
I have to preface it by saying that there's an army of people behind Sumsub ID because we all deeply care about security, privacy, and user consent, and finding that balance between making users feel at ease, but also providing businesses with the right verification data and information that they need to conduct their actual business. So with that in mind, Sumsub ID was very much designed to provide a seamless, secure, and reusable identity form while maintaining high compliance standards. And that compliance point is so important. And I'll talk about it in a second. But instead of having users upload documents and input data every time they sign up for a new service, Sumsub ID allows them to reuse that stored document and data across multiple platforms. So it's very simple. And then once that Sumsub ID account is created, it can then be used across different platforms. And the power is very much within the user, they can select what data to share. And if at all, they're very much within their right to not give consent, and that's completely okay. But we made sure that that was a part of the process, that user consent is so important. At the same time, in order to meet that compliance element I mentioned, we really wanted to take care of the fact that sometimes different companies have different regulations, different guidelines. They have to abide by different KYC or AML framework. And so what happens is, if I've created a Sumsub ID account and I have my store documents, my data, and so on, and then I go to reuse it with another company, and that company requires my ID document to be valid for at least 6 months instead of the 3 that I have left on my ID card, we will prompt for a re-upload of the document. So compliance is never really compromised at any point. And what's really interesting is that across the entire flow and process, all of these steps and checks that we have, so for the ID check, for the liveness check, the fraud prevention is really baked in, because we don't do liveness check without checking for deepfakes or a synthetic identity. We don't do an ID document check without doing an OCR extraction and checking against databases. So it's really as robust and as a comprehensive a solution as we could come up with.
So we've noticed here at Sumsub that 1 in 3 users have already verified their identity with one of our clients before. So why go through the same KYC process again and again? That's exactly why we've just launched Sumsub ID, our new digital reusable solution that allows users to create a secure, reusable identity profile, speeding up verification across platforms whilst reducing friction as well. So here's how it works. 1, the user logs into Sumsub ID, verifies their email, and selects a stored document. Secondly, they pass their liveness check. And finally, thirdly, once verified, their data can be securely shared with no more manual document uploads. So for businesses, this means 50% faster verification, 30% higher pass rates, GDPR compliance, and over 1 million Sumsub ID users. So to learn more, check out the link in the description or visit sumsub.com. Daniel, you've spoken about SingPass, the Estonian, of course, Bank ID, and now in the UK, of course, well, LSEG are based. The UK government's digital ID program will roll out later this summer in 2025, which is super exciting, right? I mean, what else are we expecting, Daniel, in the coming years and months? Are there other projects that you're keen to keep an eye out on rather than or outside of the UK as well?
Well, I mean, I think you've got the EU Digital Wallet Initiative, which currently requires all member nations to have at least one digital identity that can be presented in a mobile wallet for all residents, citizens, and subjects of the EU by January 1st, 26. So that obviously is going to be huge. There are some countries where they're already there and it's not really going to be a big lift. There's some other countries where they've got a lot of work to do in the, 9 months remaining before that deadline. I also think that there are some really interesting IDs in like Southeast Asia that aren't commercially available. So, for example, there's several in Indonesia, the Philippines, where commercialization is limited or not available at all, and citizens really only use them for government services. But given the difficulty in verifying identity in some of those regions, we're working heavily with those identity ministries to broaden the scope of those digital IDs and make them more easily accessible for commercial vendors. That should make a huge difference in minimizing fraud and improving that user experience in Southeast Asia.
Daniel, that's a super interesting point, actually. Much of our life is online now, or as is everyone's, right? I mean, internationally as well, especially when it comes to financial transactions and being included financially. I mean, on your side, Eddie, how important is getting an international agreement when it comes to regulation? Are you optimistic of that right now? Of course, we have the EU coming into play, but beyond that, of course, people wanting to remit money cross-border and across the West, East, etc. How important is that?
how important it is. I think going back to Daniel's introduction and his depiction of his life, living somewhere, working for a company based in a different country, doing business with another bank, it's crucial because this is the way that we live now. Interoperability amongst all these companies is what's going to ensure that I, as a user, as a citizen, as a normal person, adopt this type of solution. Because if I move from the US to Spain and then I go to Southeast Asia or whatever, I want to be able to open a bank account seamlessly and with very little pain. And that is not the case right now. And this is a very real problem. And it's linked to all sorts of like immigration debate and, you know, being able to prove your identity when you don't have documents in a new country, for example. It's very tricky. So I think it's incredibly important. I don't know how optimistic I am that the nations of the world will agree. But hopefully, the technology is advancing really fast, as we said before. So I think maybe that will give a push for governments and institutions to at least pay a little bit more attention. And then just sort of realize these benefits that we've been talking about for the past hour. Because it's not just about the user and making their life easier. There is a financial, economic advantage to businesses that will adopt these technologies.
Definitely the case. I like how positive we've been on this podcast episode today.
Ask me again after the podcast.
Indeed. We'll have the same conversation.
Yeah.
But of course, when we're looking at the benefits, it's very clear for people like us day to day and for businesses, of course, that we work in or that we buy or purchase or utilize the services from, how important a digital identity and also a global digital identity or cross multi-border or at least interoperable in how important it must be. I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to save businesses a lot of time and, of course, users a lot of time and a headache as well. But are there any other benefits that we could talk about and share with our audience today?
I would argue that I think that the biggest benefit, and Eddie touched on this earlier, is, you know, I think the estimates range from 600 million to 800 million people in the world don't have an identity at all. They can't participate in the digital economy. They can't transact online. They can't vote. They can't bank. And I think that's a humanitarian crisis. So I spent a lot of time in Africa about 15 years ago. And one of the things that was really interesting back then was that most of Africa skipped landlines, and they just went straight to mobile phones. So everyone had a mobile phone. Everyone had access to mobile internet, and very few people had landlines. They just never ran the cables. And I think that there's an opportunity for us in some of these more impoverished or low-income countries to take a similar initiative with identity. I would love to see us help them skip physical identity documents altogether. And let's just go straight to digital identity. Let's go straight to mobile internet access for people. And let's take that number from 6 to 800 million down to zero in our lifetimes.
I couldn't agree more.
Likewise, I don't have anything more optimistic to say than that. And I think, like for normal people, like reusable or digital identity is not something that you think about until you come across a problem, until you cannot open a bank account or whatever it may be. So for businesses, it's just a win-win. You're ensuring your users are having a great onboarding experience. You're improving your fraud prevention tactics without adding unnecessary barriers for the users. I really don't see a downside in the adoption of this.
Absolutely. Well, not so much the adoption, just maybe some of the friction that, of course, we'll see, and the adoption of new methods or methodologies from fraudsters' perspectives of trying to target these spots as well. We're coming towards the end of our podcast today. Eddie, Daniel, it's been great, but we'd love to get to know you more on a deeper level as well, a more personal level. So would you both join me for 5 quick-fire questions?
No, I'm really scared.
Well, these are quick-fire, so I'm going to ask both of you, and if you can give me a quick answer, we'll move from question to question. Are you ready?
Sure.
So when choosing a digital wallet, do you go for more features or better security?
Better security.
Better security.
What's one thing about fraud that still surprises you, even after all of your experience?
the social engineering element. How many people, regardless of the barriers put in place, voluntarily give control of their accounts to bad actors?
It does happen, doesn't it? Eddie, are you on the same page? What else is there?
The level of sophistication, I like to talk about digital literacy also being a barrier to, adopting this type of technology. And I consider myself a somewhat digitally literate person, yet sometimes I come across an email or a message in my own banking platform where I go, hold on a minute, I have to double take. I have to go, hold on a minute, is this genuine? So it's so sophisticated that I'm being fooled, and I'm not that far behind in terms of understanding the differences between a scam that my mother would be targeted with versus the ones that we're targeted with. But yeah, that level of sophistication is definitely surprising, not in a great way.
Super scary, and I think that feeds into what Daniel was saying about the manipulative side of social engineering as well. But that takes us well into our next question. Have you ever actually been a victim of fraud yourself?
Yes. Fraud. I've certainly had credit card numbers stolen and abused.
Yes, yeah.
But I will say for Eddie, I almost clicked on a link. So there's a big scam in the States right now around tolls, like highway tolls. And I had just gotten back from a road trip where we drove through some states, and I got a notice that I had unpaid tolls. And I mean, my thumb was hovering over the link, and I'm like, how did they get my phone number? So yeah, I think to Eddie's point, it's probably not an if, it's a when.
I think the most recent digital one is, and I think it's quite common in Spain actually, whenever you are waiting for a parcel to be delivered, you will get from the local post office, you'll get a text message that says, you need to pay 5 cents in order for us to unlock this thing because whatever, but it looks legitimate. And when you're waiting for something and you're excited to receive it, you're not really thinking straight, and you're like, okay, I just need to get my package. I'll pay for whatever this is. And then you go onto a website that doesn't look incredibly authentic, and then you realize. But I think that's the last thing that I almost fell for.
Okay, well, there's always next time. So stay safe, Daniel. And of course, Eddie, I also have a question on the back, which I think this flows quite nicely into. What's one habit now that you've been a victim of fraud that you rely on to stay safe online?
I don't encourage anyone to do this, but when I get the iPhone message saying your password has been compromised or whatever, ever since that started happening, I now every 3 months do a full sweep and I change all my passwords. I make sure everything is as, unhackable as possible. And I've also consolidated my email addresses because I used to have about 17 different email addresses. One was for serious business, the other one was for friends, the other one for, utilities and whatever. Now I only have 2. My personal one that I don't give out very often, and then the daily use one. So I'm also trying to just reduce my exposure that I'm willingly just giving away email addresses for people to contact me and so on.
Interesting. Perhaps a critical single point of failure then as well, Eddie.
I would say from my side, not to end us on a, we've been so optimistic here, but I think just a constant paranoia and cynicism has served me well. That if you believe everyone's out to get you, it is certainly helpful in avoiding becoming a fraud victim.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I'm on the same mindset as well. And if we're looking towards the end of the quickfire questions as well, I'd like to ask you both a very interesting one. You might be quite pensive about it, but if you could have any other career other than the one you currently have, what would it be?
I would be a photographer. It's the easiest answer I can give you. There's no risk of being scammed. You're out there in nature taking photos, and that's it. That's what I would do.
Yeah, I mean, I think no one at 5 years old says, I want to work in digital identity product and prevent online scams. So I think it's probably safe to say that all of us in this field had a dream of something else at some point. But I think I'm with Eddie. It would be something outside and something in the arts that I would want to do. I'm not quite sure what. I might need to think about that.
I think that brings us to the end of our show today. So I would like to thank both of our guests, Eddie, Daniel. You've been amazing. We've touched on so many important topics today, and we've been wholly optimistic throughout, which is fantastic. So hope the audience has enjoyed and, of course, taken some great pointers back. But is there anything you'd like to say before we go?
Thank you for having me. And I'm glad to be working alongside and with such smart people to keep everyone safe and fraud-free.
Wonderful.
Likewise. Thank you for having me, Tom.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of What the Fraud. On the next episode, fraud is no longer just about crime. It has become a global business with software at its heart. We will take a look at the rise of fraud as a service with a very special guest, a hacker turned security consultant. So calling all listeners, we need your support. So please hit that follow button on your favorite podcast platform. And of course, if this episode has left you feeling empowered, drop us a review. It helps other individuals and businesses out there trying to dodge the digital tricksters. So let's cut the small talk and get down to business. Follow, comment, review. You know the drill. And of course, if you want to hear more about what we do here at Sumsub and how your business can actually benefit from our verification services, definitely check out our website at www.sumsub.com and subscribe to our socials. What the Fraud is a Listen production. The producer is Adrian Bradley. The executive producer is Nick Minter. And the producer from Sumsub is Mila Varavina. Stay safe and see you on the next one.